Number 15. Purussaurus. Near Iquitos, Peru, there's a bone bed called Knot 069, cut into rock that is 13 million years old. In it lies the shin bone of a ground sloth. And the bone is marked 46 times. 5 of the marks are deep punctures. The other 36 are shallow pits, pressed in by teeth that closed on the leg and let go without finishing the job. Whatever did that lived in the Pebas mega-wetland system, a vast swampy proto-Amazon that once covered much of what is now Peru, Brazil, Venezuela, and Colombia. The animal was Purussaurus, a caiman, not a crocodile or alligator, though it dwarfed both. It hunted the way ambush hunters do, lying still in warm brown water until something waded past the wrong stretch of bank. Picture that jaw closing on a leg the size of a fence post and letting go and closing again. At full size, Purussaurus may be the largest crocodilian that has ever lived on any continent in any era. In 2015, the researcher Tito Aureliano and colleagues ran the numbers on a skull from the Solimões Formation in Brazil, a specimen called UFAC-1403, publishing the results in the journal Palos 1. Using scaling equations built from living caimans, they put the animal at 12.5 meters long, roughly the length of a shipping container, and 8.4 metric tons, with a bite force near 69,000 newtons, about 7 tons of force. That figure, they wrote, exceeds any bite force ever directly measured in a living animal. The consensus on Purussaurus is not really in dispute. It was the apex predator of its wetland, built to crush prey that nothing else could touch. What is in dispute is how big Apex actually got. Paiva and colleagues in 2022, and a team led by Walter in 2025, went back to that same skull and came out with something much smaller, closer to 7.6 to 10 meters and 2 to 5 metric tons. That is still bigger than any crocodile alive today, the largest of which, the saltwater crocodile, tops out around 6 to 7 meters. But it is a difference of tons on the same animal, from the same bone. The argument comes down to which measurement of that skull is correct, and whether equations built from modern caimans, none of which grow past a few meters, can be stretched to fit something several times their size. Nobody has a full Purussaurus skeleton to check the math against. Every estimate on record is a skull, and a guess about the body behind it. That gap matters, because at the upper estimate, the bite force alone raises a harder question. What was it actually built to eat? The wetlands it shared held giant turtles like Stupendemys, ground sloths, and a rodent called Jussifordigacea that may have weighed as much as 700 kilograms, roughly a horse, for a rodent. No fossil has ever caught the two of them together. Only the sloth bone and a juvenile's bite marks are proof of anything. So, the largest predator of its era is still in the paperwork, an argument, and the rest of that skull's owner has never been recovered from the Solimões mud. Number 14. Vasuki. In a coal mine in Kutch, in western India, workers pulled a run of curved, fused vertebrae out of the rock roughly a decade before anyone thought to formally study them. For years, the bones sat labeled as something else. Whoever handled them first guessed they belonged to a large crocodile. Nobody, it turned out, was looking hard enough at a coal seam for a snake. Then in 2024, 2 paleontologists at the Indian Institute of Technology Roorkee, Debajit Datta and Sunil Bajpai, took a fresh look at the bones. What they found were 27 vertebrae from the middle of one snake's body. Some of them still locked together the way they sat in life, dated to about 47 million years ago. Cylindrical, broad, and each one built to carry serious mass. No skull came with them, and none has surfaced since. What survived was a stretch of spine, missing its ribs and its tail, pulled from a lignite seam by miners who were looking for fuel, not fossils. Strip the caveats away and one claim remains. This snake, if the researchers are right about how it scaled, may be the longest that ever lived. Datta and Bajpai ran the vertebrae through 2 separate equations, meant to translate bone width into body length. That is standard procedure for a snake, known only from its spine. One equation put Vasuki at around 36 to 40 feet. The other put it at 48 to 50 feet. 50 feet stretches longer than a loaded semi-trailer. Even the low end is more than double the length of the longest reticulated python ever measured, and pythons are already the longest snakes alive today. The obvious comparison is Titanoboa, the 60-million-year-old giant pulled from a Colombian coal mine and formally described in 2009 by a team led by Jason Head. Titanoboa's vertebrae are actually a touch bigger than Vasuki's, but Vasuki's upper estimate still edges past Titanoboa's, which means the title of biggest snake in history depends entirely on which of 2 math equations someone chooses to trust. That gap between the 2 equations, 13 feet on the same set of bones, is the paper's own honest admission, and it isn't the only problem. The whole species, the whole genus even, rests on the shape of isolated vertebrae in a family of snakes where paleontologists have a long history of naming and then unnaming genera on exactly that kind of evidence. There is no skull to check the shape against. There's no second individual to confirm the first wasn't unusual. There's one animal, one incomplete spine, and two answers to how long it was. Data and Bachpai stand by their identification, and the paper was peer-reviewed and published in scientific reports. The record for largest snake in Earth's history currently belongs to an animal whose exact length nobody can state as a single number, named for the serpent coiled around Shiva's neck, pulled from a mine dug for coal. Number 13. Tylosaurus. Somewhere in the Niobrara chalk of western Kansas, a preparator works a torso free from limestone and finds it is not empty. Packed inside the ribcage are the remains of a shark, a bony fish, a diving bird, and two smaller mosasaurs, all swallowed by the same animal. Whatever this thing was, it did not have a diet so much as a hit list. That animal was Tylosaurus, and it patrolled the western interior seaway, the shallow ocean that split North America in two during the late Cretaceous, somewhere between 86 million and 66 million years ago. It was a mosasaur, a marine lizard with paddle limbs and a long muscular tail, and its snout ended in a hard bony knob it likely used to ram prey before the jaws closed. It looked less like a dinosaur and more like a crocodile, bred with an eel and scaled up past reason. The largest confirmed specimen, a skeleton nicknamed Bunker and held at the University of Kansas, measured somewhere between 39 and 52 feet long, with a body mass estimated at 9 to 11 tons. That is heavier than a bull African elephant, carried by an animal built like a torpedo. The genus name itself took a few tries to settle. Edward Drinker Cope described it in 1869 from a broken skull and 13 vertebrae pulled out of that same Kansas chalk, and two further attempts to rename it followed before Joseph Leidy's 1873 ruling made Tylosaurus the label that stuck. That much is settled, though what kind of animal Tylosaurus actually was underneath the skin is not. In 2010, a team led by Aurelian Bernard analyzed oxygen isotopes locked into the teeth of Mesozoic marine reptiles and published the results in Science. The signal showed body temperatures held steady, regardless of the surrounding water, the kind of pattern you expect from something warm-blooded, not a reptile at the mercy of its environment. In 2016, a follow-up study by Harold Perez Huerta and Suarez ran the same test on Mosasaurus specifically. Tylosaurus came back at roughly 34.3 degrees Celsius, close to human body temperature, and warmer than the fish and turtles pulled from the same beds. That is where the official story gets shaky. A body that large loses heat slowly, no matter what is happening inside it. The same principle that keeps a leatherback turtle warm in cold water without making it warm-blooded in any real sense. Both explanations, true internal metabolism and simple gigantothermy, produce nearly the same isotope reading. Nobody has yet found a way to tell them apart in the fossil record. There is a second unanswered question sitting underneath the first. Tylosaurus was eating other mosasaurs, which makes it an apex predator among apex predators. Yet whether it was actually competing with a giant like Mosasaurus for the same water and the same prey, or simply arrived earlier and left before that rivalry could happen, has never been resolved by the fossil record either. So the largest hunter in that vanished sea leaves two questions behind it. Was it warm-blooded, or just too big to cool down? And was it truly the last word in that ocean, or only the loudest voice in a conversation nobody recorded the whole of? Not everything hunted in that seaway swam. Down in the swamps at its edges, something was growing a shell wide enough to survive being bitten by things twice its size. Number 12. Stupendemys. Along the dry riverbanks near Urumaco, in Venezuela, paleontologists keep pulling turtle shells out of the rock that are wider than a dinner table. These are not the remains of some sea turtle that wandered into the fossil record by accident. Every one of them came out of a swamp. The animal that grew that shell weighed as much as 1,145 kilograms at the high end, which is more than 3 grizzly bears stacked on top of each other, and it spent its entire life in fresh water. Roger Wood named it in 1976 from a partial shell found in Venezuela and called it Stupendemys geographicus. The name got a grammatical fix in 2021 to Stupendemys geographica, but the size never needed correcting, at 2.4 meters of straight shell length, with some specimens measured closer to 2.86 meters along the curve. It stands as the largest turtle shell ever recorded, living or extinct, ahead of the ocean-going leatherback and ahead of Archelon, the giant marine turtle from the age of dinosaurs. A freshwater animal that never left its swamp had outgrown them both. For decades, that was most of what anyone had to work with, a shell and a name and no skull to match either one. Then in 2020, Edwin Cadena at Universidad del Rosario in Colombia published the first well-preserved skull and jaw ever found for the species, alongside new giant shells recovered from Venezuela and Colombia. The skull let researchers confirm something nobody had been able to check before. Some shells carried a pair of thick, grooved, bony horns jutting from the front rim, and only the males grew them, while the female's shells stayed smooth from edge to edge. It was the first confirmed case of horned sexual dimorphism found anywhere in that branch of the turtle family tree. Other shells from the same wetlands carry a different kind of evidence. They show puncture wounds and bite marks, and one specimen still holds an embedded tooth. All of it matched to Purussaurus, the giant caiman that shared these waters and ranks among the largest crocodilians ever known. So the animal was armored, and it still got bitten. The wetland it called home. A proto-Amazonian network known as the Pebas system behaved more like a shallow inland sea than a river, and researchers point to that scale and stability as the reason a freshwater turtle could grow this large in the first place. That explains where the opportunity came from, but it does not explain why nothing else ever took it. No other freshwater turtle lineage, before Stupendemys or after it, has come anywhere close to this size in any wetland of comparable richness anywhere on Earth. One species reached that size in one basin, across a span of roughly 13 to 5 million years, and it never happened again anywhere else. The horns raise a second question nobody has closed either. The grooved bone and the healed trauma on some shells suggest males may have fought head-to-head over territory or mates. Other researchers read the same horns as pure display, a signal rather than a weapon, and no study has yet found the kind of fracture pattern that would settle it one way or the other against ordinary predator damage. So the largest turtle shell ever found sits today in museum drawers in Colombia and Venezuela. The males carry horns, the shells of both sexes carry bite marks from something that could crack them, and no one has explained why a swamp built something the ocean never managed to. A shell that size still wasn't proof against every jaw in that water. One of them spent 60 years growing large enough to make the attempt worthwhile. Number 11, Sarcosuchus. Start with the skull, because it measured 1.6 meters end to end, which meant it was longer than the men who eventually dug it out of the ground. That skull came up at Gadofawa, Niger, in 1964, pulled from the sand by a French atomic energy research team who had gone looking for uranium and found a monster instead. Teeth from the same animal had already turned up in the region as early as 1946, but nobody had a skull to put them on until then. The species got a name 2 years later, Sarcosuchus imperator, and then it went quiet for 3 decades. It came roaring back in the 1990s when Paul Sereno of the University of Chicago led expeditions into the Tenere Desert and hauled out roughly 20 tons of fossil material. What it revealed, once prepared, was an animal that changed shape as it aged. Juveniles had narrow snouts, almost Ariel-like, built for snatching fish. Adults broadened out into something built to take dinosaurs. And the diet apparently broadened right along with the skull. The scale alone is worth pausing on. At full size, this was a crocodile stretching longer than 2 pickup trucks parked end to end. Sereno published the formal reconstruction in Science in 2001, using skull-length regression against living crocodilians. His team put the animal at 11.65 meters and roughly 8 metric tons, nearly the combined weight of 5 family cars. To explain how a reptile got that large, they thin-sectioned osteoderms from a sub-adult skeleton and counted growth rings, the same rings that mark a tree's age. They found about 40 of them and extrapolated that full size would have taken 50 to 60 years of continuous growth, longer than any living crocodilian survives, let alone keeps growing. Then, in 2019, a team led by O'Brien ran the numbers again, using skull width and femur proportions instead of skull length. Their figure came out at 9 to 9.5 meters and 3.5 to 4 tons, nearly half the mass of the original estimate, from the exact same fossil material. Nobody has found a new bone to settle it. The difference is pure math. 2 defensible methods pointed at the same skull, landing 4.5 tons apart, and the growth ring count that explains how it got so big rests on a single sub-adult specimen, using a technique paleontologists already know can undercount rings in older, faster-growing animals. So the field is left holding 2 competing versions of the same crocodile, and no confirmed adult skeleton to check either one against. Museum placards tend to pick a number and move on. The honest answer is that nobody has actually measured a fully grown Sarcosuchus because nobody has found one. Every figure on a documentary graphic, from the exaggerated body length to the 8 tons and the 60 years of growth, is a projection built from a young animal that never got to grow up in the fossil record. If the bigger adult ever fossilized at all, it remains buried under the Tenere, undiscovered. Until someone finds it, the largest crocodile that ever lived is a number 2 papers can agree on. Number 10, Megalania. In 1859, the British anatomist Richard Owen unpacked a crate of fossil vertebrae shipped from the Darling Downs in Queensland, Australia. The bones had come out of Pleistocene riverbank sediment, tens of thousands of years old. Owen had no skull, no limbs, no tail to go with them. Just a stack of vertebrae bigger than any lizard bone he had ever handled. He named the animal Megalania, Prisca, ancient great butcher, and from that one word, an entire monster grew. For the next century, the story stayed simple. Megalania was a giant monitor lizard, cousin to the Komodo dragon, and, by the figures commonly repeated through the 1950s, it stretched some 23 feet from nose to tail. That image made it into documentaries and museum murals for generations, dragging its bulk across the floodplains of Ice Age Australia and ambushing giant kangaroos and wombats at the waterline. And honestly, it is still the one most people carry around in their heads. Then, in 2002, the paleontologist Stephen Rowe at the University of Sydney actually ran the numbers, using comparative scaling against living monitor lizards. Rowe found the old 23-foot figure did not hold up. His revised average animal came out closer to 11 feet long, weighing somewhere between 97 and 158 kilograms, with an absolute maximum around 14.5 feet and 331 kilograms. Even at that conservative low end, it was still longer than any Komodo dragon alive today, which remains the largest living lizard on Earth. Rowe's numbers held the field for years, until a follow-up reconstruction in 2009, built on new vertebral comparisons, pushed the estimate back up again to about 5.5 meters and roughly 575 kilograms. That is nearly double Rowe's own average figure from the same fossil record. 2 peer-reviewed papers, looking at the same kind of bones, produced weights for the same animal that differ from each other about as much as 2 entirely different animals would. At the high estimate, 575 kilograms is roughly the weight of a small horse or a grand piano, moving on 4 legs and hunting. At the low estimate, it is barely heavier than 2 grown men standing back to back. Nobody currently working in Australian paleontology can tell you which lizard actually existed. Then there's the venom question. In 2009, the venom researcher Brian Fry argued that since Komodo dragons and other living monitors carry venom glands in their jaws, Megalania probably did too, which would make it the largest venomous animal science has ever documented. But no soft tissue from Megalania has ever turned up, because venom glands do not fossilize. The claim rests entirely on its living cousins, not on a single fragment of the animal itself. The official account says Megalania died out sometime after humans reached Australia, around 65,000 years ago, hunted or crowded out along with most of the continent's giant animals. But a 2015 study, led by Gilbert Price and published in Quaternary Science Reviews, looked for a confirmed site anywhere in Australia, proving humans and Megalania ever stood on the same ground at the same time, and it did not find one. The single site sometimes offered as evidence, Cuddy Springs in New South Wales, is itself disputed as proof of any real encounter, so the largest lizard the fossil record has ever produced may have vanished entirely on its own, long before a single human ever crossed its path, or it watched them arrive, and something else erased it afterward. Nobody digging in the Australian outback can currently tell you which. A single name can outgrow its evidence fast. In Egypt, an entire species has been riding on that same risk for more than a century, built from nothing but a stretch of spine. Number 9. Gigantophis. Ask how long the biggest snake in Egypt's fossil record actually was, and you will get 2 different animals depending on who answers. One version stretches past 35 feet. The other barely clears 23. Both claims are built from the exact same handful of ancient bones. Those bones surfaced in 1901, in the Fayum Depression of Egypt, a stretch of desert that was once the muddy edge of an ancient sea. The British paleontologist Charles William Andrews described them that October in the Geological magazine. What he had was a run of 20 trunk vertebrae and nothing else. No skull or tail anywhere in the sandstone, which had been sitting there for something like 37 million years. Andrews named the animal Gigantophis garstini, and from that partial spine alone, he put its length at roughly 30 feet. That estimate held for over 100 years. Gigantophis was the largest snake ever recorded, until 2009, when a very different set of vertebrae turned up and forced everyone to rethink the record books. That is when Jason Head, working out of the Smithsonian, ran Gigantophis's old vertebrae back through the math as part of the paper that introduced the world to Titanoboa. Using comparative scaling against the largest living snakes, he came out with a range of 9.3 to 10.7 meters. That is longer than a great white shark. Paleoartists have gone ahead and drawn Gigantophis doing what a snake that size would presumably do, hauling down a young proboscidine at the water's edge like something out of a sailor's worst swamp story. It is a fair guess, since elephant relatives were sharing that same coastline, but nobody has ever found a bite mark or a gut content to back it up. So the Confident Museum mural is really just a very well-dressed hunch. Then in 2017, Jonathan Rio and Philip Magnon redid the whole calculation from scratch, using different reference vertebrae from the tail rather than the trunk. Their answer came in at 6.9 meters, give or take. That is nearly a third shorter. It puts Gigantophis roughly in the same range as the longest pythons alive on Earth right now. Not some prehistoric titan at all. Nobody has ever found a complete Gigantophis skeleton, and that is the detail the whole record book rests on. Every one of these numbers, the 30-foot version and the 23-foot version alike, comes from scaling an isolated piece of spine against a chart built from entirely different species. There is no agreed method for turning one isolated vertebra into total body length, once the snake in question has been extinct for 37 million years. Rio and Magnan said as much themselves, flagging their own figure as one to treat with caution. For over a century, this snake's record was decided by a chart, not a full body. The swing between the two Gigantophis estimates, roughly 4 meters, is wider than an adult giraffe is tall, and that entire gap sits inside the margin of error for one extinct animal. The standard story used to be simple: biggest vertebrae, biggest snake. The evidence says the ruler used to measure that claim might never have been reliable to begin with. The rest of Gigantophis is still missing from that Egyptian sandstone. Until a skull or a full spine turns up, nobody actually knows which snake this animal was. That spine still can't settle how long the animal actually was. Further along the ancient coastline, a crocodilian's bite force was already climbing into numbers usually reserved for Tyrannosaurus rex. Number 8, Deinosuchus. In 1858, a geologist named Ebenezer Emmons was working through rock in Bladen County, North Carolina, when he turned up 2 fossil teeth far too large for anything he recognized. He filed them under Polyptychodon, a marine reptile, because nothing else seemed to fit the shape. Decades passed before anyone connected those teeth to what they actually belonged to. This was not a marine animal at all, but a crocodile built on a scale nothing alive today can match. By the time researchers pieced the animal together, the picture was unmistakable. Deinosuchus was a semi-aquatic ambush predator that lurked in the coastal rivers and estuaries of late Cretaceous North America, roughly 82 to 75 million years ago. It looked like a modern alligator stretched far past any modern proportion, its back studded with bony armor plates, its jaws lined with teeth the size of bananas. Osteoworms found scattered across the surface at Willow Creek, Montana, in 1903, gave the first hint of that armor. At full growth, the largest individuals reached roughly twice the length of the biggest saltwater crocodile confirmed alive today. In 2002, David Schwimmer of Columbus State University digitally reconstructed about 90% of a Deinosuchus skull, and the work with the largest animals at close to 12 meters long, replacing an oversized estimate built decades earlier from scaled-up alligator proportions. Then in 2020, Adam Cosette and Christopher Brochu published a full systematic revision in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, splitting the animal into 3 separate species spread across 2 coastlines of ancient North America. The bite force numbers are where this stops being a simple story about an oversized crocodile. Depending on the method used, researchers have calculated forces ranging from about 18,000 newtons up to over 102,000 newtons. A modern saltwater crocodile, the hardest biter alive today, tops out around 16,400 newtons. Even the low end of the Deinosuchus range beats that number, and the high end reaches into territory usually cited for Tyrannosaurus rex itself. It is tempting to picture the 2 of them squaring off across some Cretaceous swamp, crocodile jaw against tyrant lizard jaw, and see who walked away. But it is worth resisting that image. Deinosuchus had already died out millions of years before Tyrannosaurus rex ever evolved, so the comparison is a number on a page, not a fight anyone will ever get to film. What the evidence does support is stranger in its own way. Deinosuchus carried the same basic jaw and muscle architecture still found in living alligators and crocodiles, and nothing about its skull looks radically redesigned for the job. So how that ordinary crocodilian blueprint scaled up to rival or beat the bite of the largest land predator in history has no agreed biomechanical answer, and the estimates still swing by an order of magnitude between methods. The mainstream picture holds that this was simply an outsized ambush hunter, drowning and dismembering whatever came within reach at the water's edge, dinosaurs included, and bite-marked hadrosaur bones, plus a tyrannosauroid leg bone found in New Jersey backed that claim. Then in 2025, a new reclassification pushed Deinosuchus outside the alligator branch of the family tree entirely, which means the animal that left those bite marks may not belong on the crocodile side of the family at all. So the question sitting underneath all of it is not just how hard that jaw could bite, or whether it hunted alone, or ambushed the wounded. It is what to even call the thing that did it, and nobody currently agrees on the answer. Quick one, since you've made it this far, if you're still with us this deep into the countdown, this channel was built for you. Hit subscribe. Now, back to it. Number 7, Liopleurodon. For 25 years, if you knew one fact about Liopleurodon, it was this. It was longer than a blue whale, a 25-meter sea monster gliding through Jurassic oceans, its mouth big enough to swallow a small boat whole. That number came from a 1999 BBC series called Walking with Dinosaurs, and it stuck so hard that documentaries, textbooks, and museum gift shop toys kept repeating it for a generation. Nobody seemed to ask where the number actually came from. Liopleurodon ferox was real, and it really was a predator. First described in 1873 by the French paleontologist Henri-Émile Sauvage. From fossils found near Boulogne-sur-Mer, It swam the seas of the Middle Jurassic, somewhere around 165 million years ago. It had 4 powerful flippers instead of legs, a crocodile-shaped skull, and a mouth lined with teeth built for gripping and tearing. It hunted the way a shark hunts by ambush, using bulk and speed rather than patience. In 2026, Edward Bartlett and Professor David Martell at the University of Portsmouth went back through every known Liopleurodon specimen, including a near-complete skull and 2 unusually well-preserved skeletons. Published in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, their measurements settled on a maximum confirmed length of just over 8 meters, roughly the length of a school bus. The skull, once you have the whole animal laid out in front of you, only makes up about a quarter of the total body. 25 meters was never a measurement. It was a dramatization made for television that outlived the show it came from by a quarter of a century, and somewhere, a documentary editor from 1999 should probably feel pretty pleased with themselves. That should have closed the book on giant plesiosaurs, except the book would not stay closed. In 2009, a Norwegian expedition on the island of Svalbard pulled a different pliosaur out of the rock, nicknamed Predator X, before it even had a proper name. Early estimates put it at 15 meters and 45 tons. Later, more careful analysis walked that back to somewhere between 10 and 13 meters. It was formally named Plesiosaurus funki in 2012, and its numbers have been shrinking ever since. Then, in the spring of 2022, a skull eroded out of the cliffs at Kimmeridge Bay on England's Jurassic coast. Only the skull turned up, 2 meters long and taller than an adult standing upright, and no body was ever recovered to go with it. Bite force estimates for that skull run between 27,000 and 33,000 newtons. A related species, Pliosaurus cavani, has been estimated at closer to 50,000 newtons from separate work. Nobody has reconciled that gap, because nobody has the full bodies needed to check the estimates against. That is the actual ongoing problem underneath all of this. Every giant pliosaur ever handed the title of biggest marine predator alive is known from a skull, or a partial skeleton, never a complete one. Scientists rebuild a missing body, using proportions borrowed from smaller, better-known relatives, and they say so openly. The method works fine until a more complete specimen turns up and moves the number again, sometimes down, sometimes into open dispute, as it has every single time so far. Which means nobody currently knows how big the biggest pliosaur really got or how hard it could actually bite. The real record holder might already be sitting half-assembled in a museum drawer, or it might still be lodged in a cliff face on the Jurassic coast, waiting for the next storm to strip away enough rock to let it out. A crushing bite is one way to earn a spot on this list. The next name earned its size with a skull that looks like it forgot how to bite at all. Number 6, Mourasuchus. The Orinoco Formation in Venezuela has produced skulls that do not look like they belong to a crocodile at all. They are flat and wide, the snout spreading out at the front like a spatula, or like the bill of a duck grafted onto a reptile the size of a small boat. Nothing else in the crocodilian family tree looks quite like it. That alone would be strange enough. But the skull that made this animal famous is not just oddly shaped. It is mechanically wrong for what a giant predator skull is supposed to do. Mourasuchus was a caimanine, part of the same broad family as modern alligators and caimans, but built on a scale that dwarfs anything alive today. The numbers alone do not add up the way you would expect. The largest skull on record measures over a meter long, about the height of a refrigerator door. Lining that jaw are more than 40 teeth on each side, upper and lower, over 160 teeth in total, several times the tooth count of a modern Nile crocodile. And yet every one of those teeth is small and conical, too small to grip or dismember large prey. The front section of the lower jaw, where a crocodile normally concentrates its bite force, is unusually short and thin. A crocodilian this size should have a bite that can shatter bone. Mourasuchus, by the shape of its own jaw, apparently did not. That leaves an animal this size with an obvious problem. It still had to eat. For decades, the working answer, popularized by Riff and colleagues in 2010 and expanded by Bona, de Grange, and Fernandez in 2013, was filter feeding. The idea borrowed from baleen whales. Mourasuchus swept its broad jaws through shoals of fish, then pushed the water back out through its teeth while the fish stayed trapped inside. It is a good story, and it may still be true. But in 2017, Sadat and colleagues went back through the anatomy in detail and found no structural evidence that the skull could actually filter anything. Their alternative is gulp feeding, the jaw simply engulfing a mouthful of mud, invertebrates, and small fish at once. Their own paper admits it cannot yet confirm which mechanism is correct, because no fossil has ever preserved the soft throat tissue that would settle the question either way. Then there's the size problem, which should have been the easy part to nail down and was not. 2 separate peer-reviewed teams, working in 2020 and 2022, reconstructed the body length of the very same species and landed on estimates that differ by nearly a factor of 2 and close to 4 times in mass. Scientists studying the same bones cannot agree on how big this animal even was, let alone what it did with that duck-billed skull once it opened its mouth. Number 5. Shonisaurus. In the high desert of central Nevada, there's a building shaped like a barn, standing over a hillside that used to be seafloor. Inside, the rock has been left exactly where quarry workers found it, and running through the stone are the outlines of at least 37 skeletons, tangled together in a single Triassic Age layer of the Looning Formation. Quarry crews built a roof over the bones instead of hauling them out, so the skeletons still lie in the ground the way they died, packed shoulder to shoulder in one layer of rock. Local prospectors had been finding pieces of the animals since 1928, but it wasn't until major excavations in the late 1950s and 1960s that the scale of the site became clear. It was not a single animal that died there. It was a mass grave of giant marine reptiles, laid down somewhere between 215 and 225 million years ago, in the early age of dinosaurs, long before most of the other giants on this list existed. Nevada's legislature later named the genus the state's official fossil, a strange kind of honor for something that died in a pile. The animal itself, Shonisaurus popularis, stretched to about 15 meters, roughly the length of two stretched limousines parked end to end, and weighed several tons on a body built like a fish crossed with a dolphin. And it wasn't even the largest of its kind. A related animal found in British Columbia in 2004, eventually renamed Champsosaurus sicaniensis, may have reached 20 to 21 meters, deep into blue whale territory. A single jawbone fragment found in England in 2016 hinted at something bigger still, possibly 25 meters. Described by paleontologist Dean Lomax and colleagues in 2018. None of this adds up cleanly on paper. Blue whales reach that size because baleen lets them filter thousands of tiny animals out of the water in one gulp. Shonisaurus and its relatives had no baleen, and the largest species appear to have had no teeth as adults either. So how does a toothless reptile stretching the length of two stretched limousines feed itself enough to stay alive, let alone grow to the size of a whale? In 2011, paleontologist P. Martin Sander and colleagues thought they had it. Champsosaurus, they proposed, was a suction feeder, snapping its jaw open and yanking back its tongue to vacuum soft-bodied prey straight down its throat. It was a tidy answer, and for a couple of years it held. Then in 2013, Ryosuke Motani led a survey of 18 ichthyosaur species, checking for the actual anatomy suction feeding requires: an ossified hyoid bone, throat muscle attachments, and a short narrow jaw. Almost none of the animals had it. Their jaw joints instead matched ram feeders like sharks and whales, animals that swim into their food rather than pulling it in. The suction feeding idea has looked shakier ever since, and nobody has proposed a replacement that's stuck. So the giant lies there in the Nevada rock, 37 of them at once, next to relatives twice its length, and the official position amounts to this: something reptilian grew to the scale of a whale, on a body plan that offers no obvious way to eat enough to sustain it. The bones are not in dispute, where all that food went in, and how, is still being argued by the same scientists who thought they'd settled it. In a building built over a graveyard nobody has finished reading, a body can grow past every expectation, and still make sense on paper. Number 4. Elasmosaurus. Spring of 1867, a ravine north of Fort Wallace, Kansas. An army surgeon named Theophilus Turner is picking his way along an eroded bank when he spots bone weathering out of the shale. It doesn't look like buffalo, and it doesn't look like anything he recognizes. He sends 3 vertebrae east to a scientist he has never met. Those vertebrae land on the desk of Edward Drinker Cope at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. Cope takes one look and orders Turner to dig up the rest. What comes back is 900 pounds of bone and rock, hauled 90 miles by wagon to a railroad, then another 1,500 miles by train. Cope reassembles it, and the animal that emerges makes no anatomical sense on first glance. The body that comes together is stubby and compact, set with a tiny head, and then a neck that keeps going well past where a neck should logically stop. The neck alone is longer than the rest of the animal combined. Cope names it Elasmosaurus platurus in 1868, the biggest plesiosaur anyone has pulled out of the ground up to that point. He mounts the skeleton for publication in 1869, with the skull on the wrong end, because he mistook tail vertebrae for neck vertebrae and put the head where the tail belongs. In 1870, Joseph Leidy catches the error, and Cope's rival Othniel Charles Marsh makes sure everyone hears about it. It becomes one of the opening shots of the Bone Wars, the feud between Cope and Marsh that would define, and occasionally poison, American paleontology for the rest of the century. The vertebra count, once sorted out properly, turns out to be its own kind of extreme. Elasmosaurus carries somewhere between 71 and 72 neck vertebrae, according to a 2013 review by Sachs, Keir, and Everhart. That is more than double the 30 to 32 found in other long-necked elasmosaurids, and it is the highest cervical count of any vertebrate ever documented, living or extinct. One specimen turned up with 38 gastroliths sitting in its gut. Stomach stones weighing 13.1 kilograms combined, heavier than a full set of bowling balls, swallowed to help grind down whatever it had been eating. For most of the 20th century, that neck got drawn one way, rising out of the water like a periscope. The classic sea serpent silhouette everyone already had in their head from Loch Ness. Biomechanics ruled that image out completely, because the vertebral joints would need well over 360 degrees of vertical flexion to lift a head that high, and bone simply does not bend that far. So what was the neck actually doing, if not that? Two competing answers are still on the table, and neither one has won. One camp holds the animal swam with the neck rigid and straight, using the small head as a low-drag ambush point while the body trailed behind, out of sight of a fish school above. The other holds that it barely moved its body at all, sweeping the neck in slow arcs across the seafloor like a vacuum hose, grazing invertebrates without spending the energy to relocate its own bulk. Both models are built on assumed cartilage thickness, because cartilage never survives into the fossil record, and both produce a spread of possible flexion values rather than one clean answer. 80 million years ago, in a sea already ruled by mosasaurs and giant fish, something was swimming the western interior seaway, trailing a neck longer than the crocodile-sized body it was attached to. The people who study it for a living still cannot agree on how it held that neck up, how it swung it, or how it kept that much exposed length safe from the mosasaurs sharing its water. The bones made the trip to Philadelphia. The motion that carried them through an open sea for 80 million years never did. That same ancient seaway held something even a confused, oversized neck had every reason to avoid. A predator large enough to help convince the world that entire species really can vanish from the earth. Number 3. Mosasaurus. In 1794, French revolutionary soldiers marched into Maastricht, in the Netherlands, with very specific orders. Take the town and take the skull. A fossil had been pulled from the chalk quarries at St. Petersburg years earlier. First a jaw, then a fuller skull in 1780, under a quarry master and collector named Johann Leonard Hoffmann. By the time the French arrived, everyone in Europe with an interest in natural history knew the thing existed, and France wanted it in Paris. So the soldiers took it, created it, and carried it out of the country as a spoil of war. What they were hauling was a slab of curved jawbone lined with conical teeth, set in a skull nearly 5 feet long, roughly the height of the man who would eventually study it. Nobody in 1794 had a name for what kind of animal it came from. It didn't match a whale, and it didn't match a crocodile. It took a Paris anatomist to say the word nobody wanted to say. In 1808, Georges Cuvier, examining the skull at the Muséum in Paris, concluded it belonged to an enormous extinct marine lizard. That single conclusion did real work. Extinction, as an idea, was not yet accepted science. Cuvier's mosasaur became one of the fossils that helped prove species could vanish from the earth entirely, more than 50 years before Darwin published anything. The genus got its name, Mosasaurus, lizard of the Meuse, from William Conybeare in 1822. The species, Hoffmanni, was named in 1829, after the man who dug it up. For most of 2 centuries afterward, scientists scaled a full body from that one skull and got something huge, 17 to 18 meters, pushing 60 feet. At 2018, reassessment by researcher Tim Cleary and colleagues walked that number back. The better supported figure for a large Mosasaurus hoffmanni is 12 to 14 meters, still longer than a loaded moving truck, still built at around 14 to 15,000 kilograms, more than double the weight of a full-grown elephant. Late Cretaceous, roughly 72 to 66 million years ago. One of the last and biggest of its kind before the extinction that ended the dinosaurs took it too. This is the detail most documentaries leave out. Documentary animators have long drawn mosasaurs as eel-like sea lizards, undulating their whole body like an oversized monitor lizard let loose in the ocean, and in 2013, Johan Lindgren of Lund University and colleagues found a fossil that undercut the image entirely, a specimen in Jordan with soft tissue intact, showing a stiff, shark-shaped tail fin. Not an eel's tail at all. It's a real discovery, just not one about Mosasaurus hoffmannia. The Jordan specimen belongs to a smaller, different mosasaur. Whether the giant itself swam that way, whether it was a burst ambush predator or a sustained high-speed cruiser, whether it even ran warm enough to sustain that kind of swimming, is still argued over biomechanical models and educated guessing, not settled by a fossil of its own tail. So the animal that helped convince the world extinction was real still has an unanswered question sitting inside it. Every mosasaur you've watched breach a lagoon on screen is an animation built on inference. Nobody has actually caught the largest one swimming. Number 2, Kronosaurus. For nearly 70 years, visitors at Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology stood beneath a skeleton stretched to 42 feet long and were told they were looking at one of the biggest marine predators ever to swim. Nobody mentioned that a third of the bone under that paint was plaster. The story starts in 1899, when a man named Andrew Crombie picked a fossilized jaw fragment out of the ground near Hughenden, in inland Queensland. He handed it to the Queensland Museum, where curator Charles de Viz looked at the 6 conical teeth still socketed in the bone and guessed it belonged to an ichthyosaur. The fragment sat misfiled for 25 years. Then in 1924, museum director Heber Longman took a second look and realized the jaw belonged to something new entirely, a short-necked pliosaur he named Kronosaurus, after the titan who devoured his own children. It was a fitting name, since Kronosaurus patrolled an inland sea that once covered Central Australia. 4 broad flippers driving a body built almost entirely around a skull loaded with curved, foot-long teeth. One specimen still holds the stomach contents of a sea turtle. Another preserves bite marks on the skull of a long-necked plesiosaur, the first confirmed the case of one of these animals hunting another of its own kind. A juvenile skull turned up with matching tooth punctures, which raises the possibility that the adults sometimes ate their own young. The bite itself has been measured at somewhere between 15,000 and 27,000 newtons. Researchers describe that as beaten by nothing alive today, and among extinct predators, matched only by Tyrannosaurus rex. Then came the reckoning. In 2009, when paleontologist Colin McHenry spent his doctoral research pulling apart the famous Harvard Mount, built in 1958 under Alfred Sherwood Romer, with a $10,000 donation from philanthropist Godfrey Lowell Cabot. Mark Henry found 7 or 8 extra vertebrae sculpted in plaster and stretched into the spine to make the skeleton look more complete, along with a mostly invented skull roof. Painted over, the fakes were invisible to anyone standing in front of the case. Researchers now call the mount Plasterosaurus, a joke that is not really a joke. Strip the plaster out and the real animal drops to somewhere between 30 and 36 feet. Still enormous. Just not the 42-foot legend that sat in textbooks for 2 generations. What nobody has managed to fix since is the number itself. Every length estimate published after McHenry still disagrees with the last one, because no single Kronosaurus skeleton is complete enough to measure outright. Worse, the original jaw fragment that gave the animal its name turns out to be too plain, too generic, to diagnose the species at all. In 2022, a pair of researchers proposed scrapping the name Kronosaurus altogether and folding its fossils into a different genus. A 2023 paper pushed back, nominating a better preserved specimen to anchor the name and save it. As of the most recent published word on the subject, neither side has been formally ratified, which means the animal on that Harvard pedestal does not officially have a settled name, let alone a settled length. So the biggest sea monster skeleton in the world spent 70 years on display before anyone noticed the plaster underneath the paint. It raises an uncomfortable question for every other biggest ever skeleton still standing in a museum hall right now, quietly unexamined, waiting for its own McHenry to show up with a chisel. Number 1. Champsosaurus. 66 million years ago, on the day the sky caught fire, something kept swimming. An asteroid the size of a mountain had just hit the coast of what is now Mexico, and across the planet, the killing had already started. In a river system in what is now Montana, a long flat-snouted reptile about the length of an adult human moved through the current, hunting fish, while above the water, everything larger was dying. It looked almost exactly like a modern gharial, with a narrow snout lined with needle teeth, except gharials did not exist yet, and neither did anything else alive today that is related to it. It survived what killed almost everything else on Earth. This was Champsosaurus, a genus first pulled out of the ground in 1876 by the paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope, who found isolated vertebrae along the Judith River in Montana and named 4 species from bone fragments alone. It took until 1905, when the fossil hunter Barnum Brown recovered complete skeletons, for anyone to see the whole animal. What they found belonged to an order called Troistodera, a lineage with no living relatives today, built on a body plan not tried again for tens of millions of years, until true gharials evolved an almost identical snout by pure coincidence. Here's the number that matters. Champsosaurus did not just survive the extinction that killed the non-avian dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, and every marine reptile in the ocean. At least 3 of its lineages crossed that boundary intact, and within 10 million years afterward, it diversified into 7 separate species across western North America. As a lineage, Choeristodera lasted about 150 million years, roughly as long as the dinosaurs' entire reign, and it kept going for tens of millions of years after the dinosaurs themselves were gone. The usual story about mass extinctions is survival of the smallest and the most adaptable, and Champsosaurus is supposed to be the clean example. The sort of tidy resilience narrative a nature documentary would wrap up with a satisfied nod before cutting to commercial. Freshwater ecosystems weathered the extinction better than the land or the open ocean, because their food webs ran on decaying matter instead of live sunlight, which the impact winter had cut off. That explains why some aquatic animals made it. It does not explain why this one gharial-shaped lineage exploded into 7 species, while so many similar freshwater reptiles simply vanished. In 2022, the paleontologist Chase Doran Brownstein, writing in BMC Ecology and Evolution, pushed back on the field's favorite answer, that each species had adapted into its own careful niche. He argued the differences between them may just be phylogenetic accident, Evolutionary noise with no adaptive story behind it. Fossil teeth from before and after the extinction confirm that something changed right at the boundary. Nobody agrees on what or why this lineage got to be the ones still standing. Champsosaurus finally disappeared in the Miocene, having outlasted the dinosaurs by tens of millions of years. No single cause for that ending has ever been agreed on either. Something swam through the end of one world and kept going for another 100 million years, and no one has fully explained how or why it eventually stopped. Every mammal alive today, including you, exists only because something, somewhere, found a way through that same fire in the sky. Champsosaurus was never that something itself, but it swam through the same drowned rivers, breathing the same ash-choked air, and came out the other side for reasons its own bones still refuse to give up. 66 million years later, the real question it leaves behind has nothing to do with one gharial-snouted reptile from a river in Montana. It is about how thin the line was between everything that made it through that morning and everything that didn't, and how little anyone can actually say about what decided which side of it you would have ended up on.